let's do a thought experiment. All right. In this case, we're going to talk about a low-tone, hypotonic 2-year-old. Okay? Hypotonic 2-year-old whose manipulative skills are quite poor because that hypotonic baby is still, using a lot of upper extremity support to hold upright. Okay? 17 months old, before starting to walk, still does not have good walking skills, doesn't tend to, seems to have some kind of jerky head motion. So I want to work with this infant, this toddler actually, and I want to improve that child's motor skills. Now this is a 2-year-old, so I can't say, all right, we're going to lie in a prone position and we're going to work on neck extensions. Let's count them out, 1 and 2 and 3, okay? So I can't use verbal skills or a lot of instructions. So what can I do? How can I shape the environment such that this child will need to work on neck and back extensor strength just because I've created the right environment? What kinds of things what can I manipulate? Give me some suggestions.
The height level.
The height level of?
Whatever objects you're using.
Okay, is that for something for them to reach for or something they're on?
To reach for.
Okay. All right, give me a guess.
Maybe having them on a Bosu dome, so like their pelvis is on the dome and they have to extend to see things or just
Right.
interact.
BOSU?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Dome, yeah. Sometimes we just put them on theraballs, right? And you just roll them and rock them. And so you're interacting with other activities, but if you just tilt that ball in order for the child to continue to interact, they're having to do postural adjustments. Good. What else would you recommend? I might say, let's do some visual tracking games.
This is all like manipulating the environment.
I'm sorry?
Is this all like having to do with manipulating the environment?
Right, because things that you, as a teacher or a clinician or a therapist, have control over. Because while you can't instantaneously change the biology, the reality is that you want to manipulate this environment so you pull the best out of the child. Okay? So classroom teachers, this is about how do you make accommodations to your child in your classroom who has cerebral palsy and poor upper extremity trunk control. Because in fact, that upper extremity trunk control will impact how well they write. So how do we in fact work on that? One thing, we can fixate them, give them a brace and put them there. All that does though is for the moment solve the instability problem. How over the long term do you in fact want to help them maintain and improve extensor strength? Okay, so that's the key. All right, so I can change the height of the object. I could change the color of the object. Is color going to do anything to modify posture? But why might I change the color? Make it stand out. Visual discrimination. Make it more interesting. This is a 2-year-old, okay? Or I change the nature of the object, right, for something that's attractive to that child. And so these are the things, we can do these thought experiments for everybody in our class to try to figure out how do I elicit the best behavior out of this child. Now, in this case, you're looking for all of the environmental and task factors that could influence task outcome. In this case, what if I manipulated the weight of the object? Why? Because in fact, to lift something heavier, I actually have to be a little stiffer. And so it's not about I'm giving instruction, it's I just change the weight of the blocks. Or, you take soup cans and you put some lead shot in one, pinto beans in the other. And as the child has to manipulate in the environment, they're in fact working on that kind of strength. That's essentially how physical training happens in early development. It's body weight training. And so they get better at, climbing upstairs on all fours. They get better at climbing, upstairs now carrying an object. Now they're going to start lifting themselves off the ground by trying to climb trees or up mom or dad's leg, pulling themselves up. So body weight training is a lot of what we do. And in this case then, again, without having to use instruction, we manipulate the environment. So you make a list of all these factors that influence task outcome. In the language of motor programs, we call those control parameters. We shift a behavior by altering the distance an object had to be thrown or the speed with which you had to move. Those were control parameters. Okay? And again, much like Gentile's matrix, we go from what's simple to complex. And you create this matrix. You do it over on this side. So now, these are the factors and complexity. So if I said height is one of the factors, well then simple or low complexity would be low height versus high. Weight would be light versus heavy. Okay? If I did size of an object to manipulate while holding postural control, one-handed size versus two-handed. Right? Because I can still use one hand for balance control if I manipulate an object, but if it becomes too big, then, well, all the posture control has to come in my trunk while I use two hands to do this manipulating task. So you think about, remember, these have nothing to do with biology. What are you trying to teach? What are you trying to get the child to do? What are the factors that you can manipulate? And how well are they doing so far? I could body position, right? This could be sitting, this could be supine, okay, lying on one's back, and then prone. Assuming that if I have poor posture control, then lying on my back gives me the most posture control. Isn't that great? Okay? And I'm working on kind of curling up and reaching for things. And if I'm prone, then I have to do head extensor and trunk, and trying to lift shoulder, it's more demanding. But that's how I look at what my child's abilities are, and I think, well, what am I going to manipulate? Well, let's work on single-handed objects that are light, but work on them from the prone position. So it gives me a way to create, essentially, a challenge level for each client, for each individual. Now, that's what we can do on the teacher side of this. You can do the same thing for somebody who is high functioning. So this is the typical 7-year-old, pretty energetic. They are, they've got their fundamental motor skills in place. They're starting to engage now in organized sport. And so how do we begin to manipulate this? Well, we start with 1, 2, or 3 rules. Maybe large spatial areas that they should stay in certain spatial areas. We probably don't work on 3-player interactive plans, offensive strategies, but we build up to this. How much complexity are they ready for? But the other piece that we have to consider, we've been talking a lot about their maturational growth, the biological change that comes about during the period of physical growth. We've talked a lot about, well, how do these skills change? What do they look like? And at younger ages, the individual is less of a participant in the learning. But remember, we said there was this pivotal change that happened somewhere around 7 years of age in cognitive development as well. So now what we really need to do, what really helps the child engage, is that they become a participant in this process. What is the highlight of 4 to 7-year-olds? When they engage in activity, what is the highlight feature of their personality engaging in these activities? We just had this exam.
Say that again. I missed the question.
4 to 7-year-olds. What is unique about how they approach their participation in sport?
And their effort is equated to success.
That's right. If they worked hard at, they are successful. And so when you think about, okay, now I want to motivate a child to perform, I want to get them to engage in this process, well, how do I get them to participate in goal setting? So if I say, all right, I want you to be number 1 in your age group, okay? Number 1 in the class. Okay? This is a 5-year-old. I want you to be number 1 in the class. Does that 5-year-old care?
Nope.
No. If you said, I want you to be the fastest human being, go out there and do your best, will that child go after it and try and make it happen? Yeah, because fast, I'm going to work hard. Yeah, I rock, even if they come in 30 seconds. If they worked really hard at it, it's like, I'm good. You see how much I'm sweating? I'm good. Right? And we need to think about this developmental trajectory because it makes a difference as to what constitutes an effective demonstration. What do they pay attention to? So all those things we thought about in terms of what's important, what's salient to the 4 to 7-year-old, the 8 to 12-year-old, the 13 to 18-year-old, these change. And so who gives effective demonstrations? Experts? We all think, oh, we should watch an expert do something. You don't want to watch somebody who doesn't do well. You might learn bad habits, right? Wait, there's an interesting twist on this. And then verbal instructions versus implicit and explicit learning. So these are the kinds of things we have to think about. Well, how do we incorporate these? Because their effectiveness changes depending upon the developmental level of this child. So let's talk about goal setting. Here are a variety of strategies. You have outcome goals, performance goals, and process goals. The outcome goal, the score, okay? What happens external to the person. Performance goal has to do with individuals achieving a goal, success for the person, and process goals have to do with success in how the outcome is achieved. Okay. So in general, specific goals lead to better results. So if I said, this is your second year playing volleyball, you're going to do better, right? Let's just set a goal of getting better. Okay. Seems fair enough, but it's like you don't know what you're working toward. So if we say, last year, okay, you got 42% of your serves across the net. This year, let's go for 70%. Specific goal. In general, individual or experimenter set goals have led to better retention. Now, what's the difference between acquisition and retention?
Retention is remembering previous.
Yeah, so retention is remembering, that is, it's the persistent change in the ability to perform. It stays with you, versus acquisition is just, well, right now, as I'm practicing this, I look pretty good, but next week, can I still perform as well? So when you see retention, we're talking about how well something is learned. So in the context of the people you're working with, give consideration. Set specific goals. Set moderately difficult but realistic. So this is where it's really important to know your learner. Moderately difficult. So what's their present level of performance and how do you challenge them? But keep it realistic. So if I could, 314 folks, I watched you demonstrate some of your lesson plans a week or so ago. And tell me, can you give me some examples of how you structured those lesson plans to, allow for individual variability, to allow for individual challenge? Anybody want to offer up a task or a skill that they taught? Silence. Yeah, just in general.
Like, whenever I coach, I will teach, like, how to dribble. And so we, like, stretch, drop, push, push, push. So, like, we break it down into, like, words.
Okay, so dribbling. Stretch, drop, push, push, push. Okay, so what is that? We've talked about that as a means of encoding. I associate behavior with these words, cue words, all right? And so it's like individuals perform that routine as much as possible. Okay? So the game would be, or the task would be, not dribble 10 times, but let's do this for 30 seconds, right? Because some people will be able to fill that 30 seconds, others might get in 3 or 4. But the idea is that then, how do you make this a realistic goal? You have to know where your performer is to begin with. Setting up long and short-term goals, because what happens if you say by the end of the season, people want to know they're making progress along the way. It has to have temporal relevance. So the idea of being able to reward somebody for the short-term performance. I watch a lot of coaches of youth sports who, after the game, after the soccer match, they get everybody in a huddle and say, all right, so let's dissect what we just did. Because they think everything is present and that kids will remember rather than coming back next week to practice and say, okay, let's think about the things that we need to improve upon. They want to do it right after the game. But for the kids, it's like the game's done. What they want to know right now is, hey, you guys did a great job right now. Their performance is over. What are they processing? They want to process something about those goals. You met your goals. Okay. You got 1 out of your 3 goals. That's good progress. Let's keep it going. As opposed to trying to pick apart all the things that went wrong, where did they get introduction to their goals and how well they're doing there? We can make distinctions between performance and process. And remember, I'm going to talk a little bit about where our attention is directed. We tend to be better if our attention is directed to an outward goal, not something about how the body is moving. We tend to get a little caught up in that. Practice and competition goals, they can be different. Because practice is where you ought to be allowed to fail. You've got to practice the things that are not good and risk the failure more often so that you can perform better later on. If you only practice the things you're good at, you're not then strengthening the weaknesses. Recording goals. As kids get older then, there needs to be some record, some means by which you keep track of the goals and how well you're doing. Develop strategies. Yes, question.
So when you're talking about these, when you get to a certain age, like what age you talk about, like with the practice or with, like the post-game speech is done.
Yeah.
So like at what ages are you talking about?
So I'm going to come to that in a minute, but remember the matrix that you all just did? And so that's that notion that what is their perception on life and where are they willing to be self-critical? So for a 4 to 7-year-old group, at the end of no game would I go back and say, let's dissect it. For the 8 to 12-year-olds, probably the 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds, I'd be cautious. 10 might say a couple of things by the time they're 12, because remember, by the time you hit 11 and 12, physically you should be moving towards skillfulness, which means you also have a very strong internal referentative correctness for how to do the activity. So it's one of those things where you're looking across features of the individual. Motor and motor development, their cognitive development, their sense of self, intrinsically or extrinsically motivated, self-representation, self-esteem, those kinds of things. And here's the point. Consider the participant's personality and motivation. And so many of these, this is what we just went through. They're age-dependent and age-related, as well as experience-dependent. Foster an individual's goal commitment, provide goal support, provide evaluation and feedback about goals. And that's important about helping kids set realistic goals. So where we're going on this is, how do you then structure the language? How do you say, what do you want to say to a child who persistently fails at the task? Every time they touch the ball, it goes to the wrong place. What do you say to that child? Yes?
So like if it was passed to them and then they would pass it off, like, oh, you did a good job of when you got the ball, you got in your triple threat position, or just have something positive to keep them moving along.
Yes.
In those, like, oh, okay, I did step 1 out of these 15 steps needed to catch it and pass it to the right player. I've done part of it. Okay, I'm making progress.
Right. And one of those things that we'll talk about is that sandwich method of delivering information. You pick something that was very positive, you give a correction, and you motivate toward being able to work on that weakness. So you start with the good. That was great. You got yourself in position. Let's work on then keeping the arms away from the body. I have volleyball in the brain because I'm watching my daughter play weekly volleyball, and she's one that first 3 weeks she could never get a serve over the net. Now she's starting to. It's like, okay, and it's amazing because you see developmental differences. 10-year-old, 10, 11, 12-year-old girls cannot predict where the ball is going to drop. So it's like, they call it mine, mine, mine. And then all of a sudden, as it gets closer, it's up here, and they go, whoo! And the person behind them is thinking, you called the ball. Aren't you supposed to take it? But it's like, when it got so close, it's like, oh, actually, I can't play the ball. It's not to me. And so you see these interactions of developmental skills. So you might say, well, I want you to be so much better at playing the ball, but part of this is the biology of growth and development as well. So these are the kinds of things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what seems to be developmentally appropriate. So here's from the chapter. So we're talking about how does developmental level impact the choice of outcome goals. Right? Now, this is an example from the text that just says, here's an example of what an outcome or a performance or a process goal is. But the layer we need to put on top of that is, well, what age group are you teaching? What's the age of the kids in your class? Because what is important to them is going to be quite different. So if I'm doing rifle shooting, finish first in a local shooting competition, that's a high-level goal. It's an outcome goal. It's a measurable goal. And what does it mean for the individual in terms of their own performance? Improve bullseye shooting percentage from 60 to 70. Process. Exhale slowly. That's that internal focus. Now, we haven't talked at all yet about how to turn a performer's attention inward, to be reflective on the feedback they get from an outcome. But that's part of our pathway now for this last section. Water skiing, qualify. Okay, this is this external goal. Let's try and achieve this. What would it mean for me personally? Increase average number of successful buoy passes from 4 to 5. how might I work on that specifically? Visually focus on outside. Give me a specific target. So these are the different kind of goals, but what we want to do is to be mindful of the developmental differences in what is important to me, what is salient. Volleyball, win the conference title, improve blocking percentage, penetrate the plane. You know, that's a technique issue. All of these in this table from the text are high-level goals. So they're easy to understand, but it doesn't do a very good job of helping us see how we would rewrite this for different levels of performers. So here's an example of one of the matrices you developed. Okay? And remember, here is our mountain of motor development, and it's age associated. And here's Piaget and our cognition, which is age associated. And here's Erickson's model, which is age associated. Harder and self-efficacy, representations of self that are associated with age, and self-regulation, which is associated with experience, and Hellesen and Cote. So we look at this and say, all right, so if I am in my fundamental movement skills pattern, and I'm pre-operational, you know, that means that I'm still fairly egocentric. It means that the performance is what's important to me. So setting up a goal for, all right, you're in Gray Y Soccer, age 5, let's go for the city championship, is like, sounds good, have no clue what it means for me, and it's not important. You know, watch my kids in summer swim, and it's like, you know, we want our team to win Fast Frog Championship. Great, but the only thing that matters to that kid is that day, that swim, that performance right then. So they don't have that distance and time. So setting that up is actually not a useful goal, something that will motivate that child. If I am, you know, the 10-year-old and I'm in concrete operations, remember what this means is that what I see is what is. I don't hypothesize well, so any kind of strategies should be from one person to one other person. Too many players in an offensive or defensive strategy, and I lose track because I can't predict. I can't see in my mind's eye where they're likely to be. And, you know, if I am one who is struggling with, you know, industry versus inferiority, then setting up goals that compare me to others, even though they're now, these others are now important sources of information to me, if I'm still feeling inferior. Remember, this is the age at which I'm trying to figure out, am I industrious? Do I work hard? Can I achieve? Or because now I'm comparing myself to everybody else, am I really inferior? How can I show that I have industriousness? And so when you say, well, when do you say? When you help them pick it apart, is you want to know whether or not they're here or whether or not they are here, you know, that is, where do these experience-associated traits land on this age-changing, developing system? And that's the importance of that work we've just been talking about is, you know, goal setting has to be relevant to the person and relevant to their stage of development. Now, I know that, you know, I didn't expect you to be able to read all this, but because you all, in my class, had just finished creating a model like this, I wanted to bring it back into the picture to say, so now when we think much more about the individual performer, how does this map help you? And the goal is that it helps you by thinking about the nature of the learner. And that's really the focus of our last you know, major section of the class. Now we talk about demonstrations, because we all think that kids learn by demonstrating, right? Show somebody how to do something. What's our goal in doing this? Well, Obviously, our goal, whether it's in a classroom, in the backyard, on a youth sport team, in a rehabilitation clinic. Obviously, our goal is to help the learner acquire new skills. And how to pull out abilities that they actually already have. We want to, in many cases, reduce avoidance behavior so we can use our models to manipulate these things like intrinsic motivation, okay, inferiority versus industry, that we can use the model to infer industry. You're capable of doing this. Okay. We can use the models to help affirm self-esteem and self-efficacy for these activities. So the model, the demonstration, is not just a visual representation, but we want to use those models and demonstrations as ways of really matching with the psychological features of the performer as well. Well, who's most susceptible to these? Effectiveness and non-effectiveness of demonstrations. So thinking about the developmental changes, when should we be demonstrating? Goes back to our first question. Are we teaching for the gold standard? Or are we teaching for consistency? Just one piece. Repetition, 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 repetition. Or are we teaching for the ability to be variable? So, demonstrations may be effective when we're getting the idea of a new movement. If you're learning something brand new, would you like to see a demonstration of it? Most people say, yeah, I want to get some sense of what this looks like. When you require a template, remember, if you don't have a motor program formed for this, that's likely to be children who are novices in most all skills, and then can be young adults, older adults, who are just learning something brand new. Learning a sequence. If it takes a sequence, then a demonstration is often useful. Why? Because you're trying to learn the different parts and the order in which they go. Strategies and decision making. Why do all the teams now sit down and review the video or the films from that day's game? When we scout other teams, why do we review their video? Because we're looking for strategies and decision making. But have you ever thought about this, that demonstrations can also help people learn to cope with the frustrations of loss and failure? So you think about that. What is this demonstration for? We most likely associate the demonstration with, here's how to do the action. Watch the movement of the arms and the legs, versus when they miss the ball, how do they respond? How do they cope? So demonstrations can be very effective in helping to manage that emotional, that cognitive and psychosocial side of how do I deal with this circumstance. Now, when might demonstrations not be very effective? Well, if it's a simple task, it's like, okay, I get it, I see it once. Or you can imagine it. If you already know the task and the requirements, or if the new task just requires a change in parameters. Remember, parameters in a motor program, you have the invariant features, and then the parameters are those pieces that allow you to scale that motor program to meet different environmental contexts. When the outcome is more important than how the movement is performed. It's like, just make it happen. So in that case, you're not actually trying to train a motor program for a consistent, repeatable response. You just want whatever works to make the outcome goal happen. And the outcome is clear and performance feedback is available. So how much feedback does one need in putting, in golf, when I can feel the contact of the club with the ball, I can see how close it gets to the hole. So that feedback is more prescient. It is dominant, as opposed to having somebody else say, watch me do this. You don't get the relevant feedback. What you need to do is feel the stroke, feel the connection to the ball, feel, and then visually see it run. But watching somebody else do that is not as effective. So it's like, how do we set kids up now so that they own the goals, and how do we deliver that information to them? Why is the effectiveness of demonstration limited if informational is available through feedback? Demonstrations lose their effectiveness if there's a lot of information available through feedback. How can demonstrations help learners focus on perceptual cues? There's this fellow in psychology, McLeish, who studies how baseball players figure out where to go to intercept a ball, outfielders. So, who plays ball? How do you know where to stand so that you can catch a ball hit if you're playing outfield?
You space yourself out between the other people, and like if you're playing left field, you're not gonna get really close to the line because it's not worth going over there to get those balls because they're gonna be foul balls.
Right, low percentage, okay.
And then based off where the other people are.
So if the ball's in the air and you think it's coming to your zone, how do you decide that you're in fact in the position where you can catch it? Experience. Yeah, but when you're trying to teach somebody, then it's like, well, is it just trial and error? So McLeish was trying to figure out, well, what are the perceptual cues that people use? So the first thing he thought, and he's looking at baseball professional players. So he put cameras, and because when a ball is hit, people in the stands will look toward where it's going to go down, right? So they have a sense, they have this kind of off the field perspective, and people literally will track. And so he thought, well, maybe baseball players are picking up the perceptual cues from looking at the stands as they are turning to run. They begin to look where the audience is looking. Okay? But that didn't turn out to be the thing. Yes?
I was going to say, how does that work for like high school baseball players where there's no one out in the outfield looking at the ball?
Right. Okay, so
in my high school they had like an iPad and they would tell you where you have to go, like, okay, this bat is gonna come up, you have to go far, you have to come up short, something like that.
So based on the statistics of where that person typically hit? Right. And so that you can place the people, but remember, these perceptual cues are what get you to the location. It's called coincidence, anticipation, timing. How can I arrive at this location at the same time the ball gets there so that I can catch it, right? And so what he discovered is that the perceptual cue, remember, sensation is receiving sensory information. Perception is the story you make of it. What he figured out was that, in fact, the baseball player runs. If I am not in line with the ball, I see the ball traveling in 2 dimensions. It's going laterally and it's going vertically. The baseball player goes to the location where the ball is traveling only in one plane, vertically. It appears to go up, it appears to go down. So the rule, the perceptual rule is move until there's only one plane of motion. And so that's this minimization function of how do I get to the right spot? It's moving laterally, but now it only appears to be moving vertically. Ah, okay. Now I have only one plane of motion in which to operate. So demonstrations can't do that, right? How can coping models help reduce avoidance behavior? So now remember, you have expert models and you have a coping model. What's a coping model? Well, somebody who's not skilled, who's learning it just like you. So it isn't always that we need the expert.
Wait, so you said for demonstrations, help learners focus on perceptual skills. You're saying demonstrations do not help them with perceptual skills?
Yeah, it's when we ask the question about the effectiveness of models and demonstrations, it's more than just the sequence of activity we have to learn. We have to learn about the perceptual cues that make us successful. And demonstrations are not particularly useful for those perceptual cues because they're externalized. Another person is doing it, so you can't get their sensory information.
What did you say was the different, like you have the expert and the coping model, what was the difference?
So the expert is the one who knows how to do it. They have outstanding movement skill, they're very consistent, and when they demonstrate, they will be successful. The coping model is one who is trying to gain skill mastery. They're coping with poor skills, and so over the sequence of demonstrations, you may see them in fact have the aha moment or improve the skill. The advantage of the coping model is I can see myself in that person. It's like I'm not skillful either. It's like, oh, but if they can learn it, then I should be able to learn it. Right? So rather than avoiding something that I don't want to do because I don't have self-esteem, I don't have high self-esteem, I have low self-efficacy for this activity, if I use a coping model, somebody who's like me and go, well, that person can't do it either. Oh, look, they're getting better. Oh, maybe I have a chance too. Yes?
Where would you put something like swimming on that spectrum? Because with swimming, I mean, you can't see yourself. I mean, yeah, you might get a second or two faster per 100 yards, but really, you think, like, you'll swim back and forth, like, oh, I must have perfect form. You see yourself on video, and you're like, oh my goodness. Like, where would you, and then you can demonstrate for somebody, but the fact that you can't see yourself, it makes it.
It emphasizes proprioception. And that's why the demonstration, I've always wondered about the literature that shows that you do dry land practices for swimming, and then you jump in the water. And I wonder about, I've not read this literature, but I wonder about the efficacy of dry land practice compared to what you do in the water because the physics and the proprioception are so different. But here's, in fact, is a study done on swimming, okay, looking at kids, and looking at different kind of models. So I'll highlight, this is in your book, okay, but here, we're going to take kids who are about 6 years of age, and we're going to put them into 3 different groups. That group is going to be a control group, watching a peer who has the skill. Peer mastery means I'm looking at somebody who's my age but is experienced and good at the skill. And here's peer coping. That is my age but is working on getting better at the skill. Okay? So they come in and the control group is going to watch cartoons on a video. And the peer master group observes a video of a similar age peer who's good. Okay, and who's positive in verbalizations and technically correct in swimming. And then the peer coping group is going to watch a peer who is increasingly positive and showed gradual improvement in swimming. So they would come in and do their, watch these videos, then go swim, and then come back the next day and watch these videos, go swim. And the coping and mastery groups were superior in swimming performance than the control. That's what you expect. They got some added instruction. But importantly, coping models had a stronger effect on self-efficacy. Remember, self-efficacy is how good do I feel about myself in this context. So that speaks not just to how well do I teach the technical aspects of the skill. It goes to how well am I massaging your psyche to believe you can be successful. And so these are powerful means of modifying children's behavior, the development of children in their work at acquiring new skills. Now, this is a class on typical motor development, but the reality is that when you have somebody who is atypical, we often think of them as atypical in their motor capacity. Right? That they have to use a wheelchair. They have spina bifida. They have Down syndrome. They have cerebral palsy. Okay? But don't forget about the cognitive and psychosocial aspects of these performers as well. So their self-efficacy for trying these skills is also very important. So if you're going to do adaptive skiing or adaptive bowling, okay, then these are still aspects of the performer that are important for goal setting. How you proceed in getting that person to engage in the activity. So learning models, by definition, a learning model is not an expert. There used to be this big debate about, if you're going to show a performance, shouldn't you show the absolute right way to do it? Well, actually, apparently not. That it is just as important for children to see that others cope well and overcome their insecurities and, in fact, get better. And this model demonstrates a process, not just, this movement. It's this process of engagement and responding to the outcome. So we're not just teaching sequence. We're trying to engage them in thinking through and being personally invested in trying to improve. All right. So let's turn the lights on in the back. And let's just pause for a moment. And what I want to do is have people work in some small groups. Take that handout I gave you. Use the back side of it if you need to. But what I want you to do is now we're going to identify an individual. Male or female. What's their age? Write 3 things you know about that person in terms of psychosocial attributes. Those are the things based on their age and their gender, and now you're going to write down 3 age-associated attributes of who that person is, and then I want you to pick an activity and tell me how you will help them do goal setting, specific kinds of goals. So you write them down. It's like, what does that specific goal look like for that person? Okay. And give me 3 examples of how you'll work with that person based on their developmental level. Those of you who are in 314, make sure you're just in a group with at least 1 or 2 of my students so that, because they bring that psychosocial content to that discussion, okay? So we're just going to take about 5 minutes and talk about, okay, so how do we then adjust our expectation for goals for the individual who is in front of us? So do just quick, turn to your neighbor, 3 or 4 of you in a conversation, write it down, and then we'll talk about some examples.